Doing good? How was the ladies' session? Nicole is really glad to have that over with. So, thank you for being supportive. I was tempted to turn the microphone on up there and just like talk into the ladies' session and let you think it was like a voice from heaven or something. But we're going to talk about the second priority of a healthy marriage. We'll probably talk about priority number 2 and priority number 3, and then focus on priority number 4, which is a more brief one, during our question and answer period after lunch. The second priority is sacrificial contribution, where you're making sacrifices to contribute to the relationship. And a lot of times the trouble we have in our marriage is that we come at it with putting all the expectations on our spouse. And that's somewhat natural, because when you ask the average young couple, why do you want to get married? If you get them alone and you say to a young lady, why do you want to marry him? Or if you say to a young man, why do you want to marry her? Their answer, and this is sincere and not necessarily problematic on its face, their answer is because of what that person does for them. He makes me laugh. He's so charming, or he's so thoughtful, or he's so kind, or she is so beautiful, or she is so easy to get along with, or she's so fun to be with, or whatever. They usually answer with some quality they've discovered in this person, and that's fine, that's normal. The problem is, what happens is, we go into marriage with a little bit of a selfish disposition. We wanted to marry this person because we knew we wanted to spend the rest of our life with them because of the way they made us feel. But what about when they don't make you feel that way some days, or months, or years? We sometimes have these expectations. Nicole, for example, didn't expect to be neglected our first couple of years of marriage. Well, I worked more than I should. She could not have predicted my workaholism, so she was surprised and discouraged by that, and threatened me. She didn't really threaten me. We need to come to the place where we realize that instead of basing our marital joy and health on our spouse's performance, we put the responsibility on our own shoulders. We place expectations on ourselves instead of placing expectations on them. So let me talk to you first of all about the destruction of selfishness. Selfishness is a destructive thing, and we all have it within us. And if you don't think you're naturally a selfish person, you might be the worst case of all. Because we are naturally selfish as human beings. And this posture of saying, I want you to meet me halfway and I want you to contribute more, I'm not getting out of it what I'm putting into it, that posture will destroy. Why? Because it focuses on getting instead of giving. Philippians 2:4 is a wonderful verse. It says, let not every man look on his own things or his own interests, but every man also on the things or interests of others. Don't come into a relationship, whether that's at church or at work or in a marriage, don't come into it looking for what you can get out of it. Come into it looking for what they can get out of it because you made an investment. Our selfish nature is to focus on getting instead of giving. The selfishness results in anger instead of patience, because we're angry that we're not getting what we wanted to get. Selfishness spends time and resources to please self as opposed to please others. That's the selfishness we have that comes natural to us. And we need to replace that with, letter B, the disposition of a servant. The word servant, or the concept of a servant, is a great word picture for each person in this room to shoot for what kind of a lifestyle they should embody as a mate and even as a parent. Someone said, I had kids because I got tired of having to get up and get the remote for myself. Some people even think kids, are just to be, seen and not heard, and there to help out. The reason you have them is so that when they finally get old enough to mow the lawn for you, or whatever. Well, we need to have a servant's heart, and we are our kids' authority, and we are our kids' leader, and we are our kids' trainer, and our kids should help with chores and things of this nature. But the idea is that every person in the home develops a servant's heart, and that the kids learn what a servant heart looks like from their parents. And it's a counterintuitive thing, but it's such a healthy and wonderful and instructive thing for even parents of teenagers to have moments in the relationship where the parent is serving that teenager and being a blessing to that teenager and being an encouragement, making sacrifices for that teenager. And especially in marriage, of course, each member of the equation should view themselves as a servant. Servanthood, of course, it's a theme that runs throughout the scriptures, especially in the New Testament. It says of Jesus in Philippians 2, he took upon himself the form of a servant. Servanthood, first of all, is rooted in humility. Our culture has very little value or esteem for servanthood or humility, right? Humility is not applauded or encouraged. Servanthood is not something that the culture or university or someone would say you should pursue servanthood. But when it comes to marriage, you do well to listen to this instead of what they're saying and pursue servanthood. Be clothed with humility, 1 Peter 5:5, because God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. I will tell you from my own personal experience, my own personal failure, that marriage can bring pride to the surface unlike many things could. Marital conflict, marital ups and downs can bring pride to the surface. Nicole has this unique gift to bring the pride out of me, to bring it to the surface. And it's not because she's antagonistic, or at least not more than average probably, but we're in a marriage, and a marriage, just any marriage, it's going to bring it up. It's going to bring it to the surface. Pride and arrogance and stubbornness. Proverbs 13:10, only by pride cometh contention. Wherever there's contention happening, even if it's in a church with brothers and sisters fighting, or if it's in a home with spouses fighting, only by pride does that contention come. Servanthood is rooted in humility. The Bible says that God gives grace to the humble. I need God's grace, and he resists the proud. I'm fighting God when I'm fighting my spouse in pride, because God resists the proud. Servanthood also focuses on my responsibilities over my rights. I need to learn as a servant to focus on my responsibilities as a husband instead of focusing on my rights as a husband. You hear it all the time, and maybe the reason I think I hear it all the time is because I've thought it so many times and been tempted to take this posture of, I deserve fill in the blank. I think I work hard enough that when I come home, I deserve fill in the blank. Guys have used that statement. Guys who work hard and do, are diligent employees and providers for the household. They sometimes come home and they say, I think if I work hard, I deserve whatever it is. I deserve to come home to a clean house. I deserve to come home to a wife who shows me some respect. I deserve to have romance, whatever it is. And while a clean house and romance and respect are all worthy things to desire and normal things to desire and hopefully things that will develop, demanding them as rights is not the way to get them. Basically, that's the way to make everybody miserable. And servanthood, it's counterintuitive. Servanthood is going to bring those things out eventually, not a focusing on my rights, what I deserve. Don't use your liberty as an occasion for the flesh, Galatians 5:13, but by love serve one another. What a great verse. It's not a verse in a marriage passage. It's in the context of the Christian community. But if you're two believers, you are in the Christian community as a couple. By love, serve one another. as you serve one another. It's one of the greatest ways to show love. You say, well, I would take on the disposition of a servant, but I don't think my spouse gets it. Well, this next little bullet point's for you. Servanthood does good without expectation of receiving something in return. We have this tendency as human beings, at the top of the food chain, trying to protect ourselves, self-preservation. We don't want to do that. We don't want to serve unless we know there's going to be some payback for having done it. We're tempted to say, well, I was so unselfish and servanthood, and then you didn't reciprocate. We got to put that aside. We got to put that human tendency aside. And we've got to say, I'm going to serve because God told me to, and he gave you to me, and I said vows to you, and he instructs me, and I'm accountable to him long before I'm accountable to you. I'm accountable to him for taking on the disposition of a servant toward you. Jesus, of course, was the disciples' authority and leader, and yet he washed their feet. And then ultimately laid down his life on a cross, taking their sin, absorbing their sin. And then husbands are told to love their wives like that. So if I suffer for Nicole's sin, that's okay. Some of you didn't realize she sinned. And I can't think of any right off the top of my head. But we all sin. And if I suffer for her sin, just another opportunity to do exactly what Jesus told me to do. And to kick and scream and whine and cry and take vengeance and get even and argue about my rights is silly for me. It's unchristian, it's unchristlike, it's unservant-like. I need to take on the disposition of a servant. And then third, I need to make a decision to serve my spouse. There is a decision, a determination we need to make to serve, because when Jesus took upon himself the form of a servant, it turned into some action. What does it look like to serve your spouse? I'll give you 3 suggestions. Study your spouse so that you might understand him or her. Figure him out. You married someone that you're going to be able to have a lifetime to figure out. And it takes a lifetime sometimes to figure them out. Men have often expressed frustration over not understanding how women think or why women operate the way they do. It's a great mystery. I heard about a guy who got a hole-in-one, and he went to get his golf ball out of the hole, and before he could get to the hole, a genie came out of the hole. It's a true story. And the genie said, I'm the hole-in-one genie, and I'm going to give you any wish that you would like for having gotten this hole-in-one. And he said, cool. And he thought a minute, and he said, I would like a bridge to Hawaii. I've always wanted to visit Hawaii. I'm terrified of flying. I will not fly, but I could drive there if there were a bridge to Hawaii. And the genie says, that's a huge ask. I mean, it's this many thousand miles. The ocean is this deep. Is there anything you can think of that would be maybe not quite so extreme and extraordinary? And the golfer said, you know, I've always wanted to understand my wife with great precision and insight. And the genie said, all right, do you want 2 lanes on this bridge or 4 lanes? Because to understand a wife is quite an extraordinary thing. But you can do it. Dwell with your wives according to knowledge. Learn about her. Think about it. Take a little inventory. This is not just a theory, a principle. What have you learned about your spouse lately, and how has it changed you? She's sensitive about this, or she loves this, or she hates that. What have you learned, and how have you adjusted? That's what servants do. Servants adjust to please the person they're serving. And you expect that when you go to a restaurant. Nicole can get disappointed if the soup isn't hot at a restaurant. And so we've had moments in Panera Bread where we went to the restaurant and went back to the kitchen area and said, "This soup is lukewarm." We weren't nasty about it. We said, seriously, could we get some hot soup, please? It's like a blizzard outside. We came in here because we wanted hot soup. Can you make it hot? We expect at restaurants that if our drink is empty, they're going to refill it. And if we're waiting on, and we have this restaurant where their breadsticks are the best I've ever had in my life. In fact, if you ever visit, Howell, we'll take you there. They're the best ever. And I know breadsticks. And I would know. And we ate there Sunday with a new family in the church, and it was forever before they brought the breadsticks. And I'm like, they're included in every meal. You don't have to wait for us to tell you we want those breadsticks now. I mean, I'd preached twice that morning, and it was like 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm like, I could eat an elephant, and I want those breadsticks. It's why we came to this restaurant. And I was finding myself having a hard time enjoying the conversation because I'm like, where are the breadsticks? We expect to be served at restaurants and hotels. The first iron I used yesterday, I was almost late last night to dinner because the first iron we used, it's always nice when you put the iron on your clothing and then discover, the iron had stuff burned onto it that is now. So we're like, we need a new iron. And 30 minutes later, no new iron. I'm like, we're on the first floor. It should be an easy trip. So 30 minutes later, hey, we still need that iron. We actually have to leave in 5 minutes. And we were nice about it. We learned not to be nasty about stuff like that. It doesn't pay. They can do things to you. They're clean. They're going to clean your room tomorrow. So my point is this: we expect good service when we're at a hotel or a restaurant. We expect the staff in those places to kind of cater to us and meet our needs. And so here's my question for you: if you're going to be a servant to your spouse, what have you done lately that takes on that posture of, I really think she would like it if. I really think it would be an encouragement to him if. I really think I could change this. And that's a great way to communicate love, is by your spouse observing in you something that they did to better serve you, only because they had discovered it would better serve you. It means a lot. It's a great way to show love. By love, serve one another. This is the decision to serve your spouse. Study them. Find practical ways to serve them. Find needs and meet them. Does your wife need to be communicated with more? My wife sometimes needs to be listened to more. Sometimes there's like this gotcha moment where she's like, do you know what I was just saying? It's like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. I have no idea because I was tuned out. Does your wife need you to listen better? Does your husband need you to be more affectionate? Does your spouse need you to praise them or help them with some practical chores? For example, when I was being raised, my dad didn't help with the kids. It just wasn't part of the culture. And my brother and I have had to learn that maybe that's not really an effective, way. My dad's 77, 78 years old. 78 last month, has never changed a diaper in his life. He has 3 kids and 14 grandkids. Never changed a diaper. 11 grandkids. I don't know how many I have, but I learned when our kids came along that was not going to be really a workable situation for Nicole, that I would never change one. This is not something I'm shooting for when I'm 78. I decided early on that that's not going to work out. But my point is, your spouse might need practical help. Nicole, I don't know how many of you argue. How many of you in your family, both of you, if you're married, drink coffee? Raise your hands. You ever fight over who has to make it? And Nicole said, this is like hands down a biblical issue. You're supposed to make the coffee. I'm like, how is that a biblical issue? She's like, there's a whole book, Hebrews. And honestly, I'm telling you that sometimes when I'm like super, super, super exhausted and I'm about to like crash for the day and I see her over there making the coffee, I'm like, that is a good woman right there. And she's felt the same way about me. Find ways to serve. Okay. Make the necessary sacrifices. These are little things, but they actually mean something, don't they? These little sacrifices. Sometimes you'll make a great sacrifice for your spouse. A spouse will sacrifice. Nicole made a great sacrifice when we moved from California to Michigan. We lived there for 18 and a half years. All 4 of our kids were born there. Wonderful Christian school, wonderful youth group, a lot of friends, wonderful environment, great place to worship, great place to serve, very secure, didn't require a lot of faith, frankly. And I said, honey, I have this idea. I think I want to pastor, and I think we should go take a church that is, not going to be able to pay us what we make here, and there's no youth group, there's no Christian school for our kids. No, you don't have any friends there. There's no one there, and I think we should, and your parents live next door to us in California. I think we should move to Michigan. Yeah, that's where my parents live. And this whole process. Now, it was God who called us there and led us there, and God, we can both see God in the whole process. But that was a huge thing. And I will tell you, when she was so supportive, and before we knew it would be Michigan, we were looking anywhere. We were willing to go anywhere. We talked to churches in California and Arizona and Ohio, of all places, God forbid, Florida. We were willing to go anywhere, but when I was so blessed 3 or 4 or 5 years ago when we started having these conversations about launching out from our very secure place where we'd been for 16, 17, 18 years. I was so blessed by her supportiveness and her willingness to follow that faith instead of over my dead body posture. And that was a big sacrifice. That's an example of a big sacrifice. But little sacrifices, big sacrifices. 1 John 3:6 says, we perceive the love of God because he laid down his life for us. We perceive his love because of what he did for us. The great love wherewith he loved us. Well, your spouse is going to perceive your love based on the sacrifices you make for them. It's a great way to show love, making sacrifices. And it beats this tug of war every time where we're trying to get our spouse to come to where we're at or where we're placing our expectations on them. So the second priority is sacrificial contribution. The third priority is sensible communication. Sensible communication. Some couples think they can't communicate. And it's funny, I've had, over the years, I taught a couples group in Lancaster for 17 years, and a lot of first-generation Christians and a lot of ups and downs and young couples. And I've had a lot of people come to me over the years and talked about their marriage problems. And what's funny is there are a lot of different kinds of marriage problems, but so many of those problems, when they come to you and talk about them, it's like, we have a communication problem. Well, maybe your problem is actually totally different. Maybe your problem is that you're like mean or evil, but it's like they think it's a communication problem because they're always screaming at each other, okay? So communication is this thing that is kind of the most oft-repeated thing. We struggle with this, and I understand that it is an issue. And I want to talk to you in this next point. We're not going to finish this point before lunch, but I want to talk to you about sensible communication, how to communicate with one another in a way that is effective. All communication is learned. So we can unlearn bad old habits and we can relearn new skills that enable us to communicate with each other. There are a lot of things hindering our communication. We get busy, we get distracted with the television, the telephone, the kids, the schedules, the overtime, the responsibilities. Fear of conflict keeps us from communicating sometimes. But the Bible teaches that the tongue is a powerful component in this equation, and we must learn how to use it. The lips of the righteous know what's acceptable. Those who walk with the Lord and come close to the Lord and follow the Lord will learn how to communicate well. And I want to give you 3 ways you can communicate. First of all, you can communicate with depth. Guys tend to need to learn this more than ladies. Learning to communicate with a level of depth. We oftentimes talk about surface stuff. Like, you're not going to find 2 guys in this room over in the corner, like really just pouring out their heart to each other. But the women, they'll do it, because it comes more natural to them. we need to learn to communicate with depth. There are 5 levels of communication. There's cliche, there's fact, the weather, something like that. There's opinion. A lot of times we talk about, and guys will get down to that one. They'll share their opinions about their sports team or politicians or whatever. And then you get emotional sharing. Guys usually don't tiptoe into that realm as much, but we need to learn to. And then there's transparency, where you're really getting vulnerable and sharing thoughts and feelings and needs. And we have to avoid hurting our mate on one hand, but most marriages are in need of sharing a greater depth of feelings. And so the risk of being hurt must be taken. If you can't share your feelings with your spouse, Rainey said, your marriage is on superficial ground. You're not going to grow, and neither will your partner. So deep communication is open and transparent, and it is also meaningful in its content. Do you and your spouse talk about meaningful stuff? Sometimes a marriage, especially with a few kids, all they're ever talking about is what's going on at work and with the kids and at school and at church maybe. It's like it's all about that stuff, and it's never meaningful with one another. It's just about who needs to pack the next lunch and who needs to go on the next field trip and who needs to do the next chore. It's not about death. Here are some things you could talk about. And one of the reasons marriages struggle at the empty nest phase is because the kids are all gone and the school activities and sports programs are all done with now. And we don't have much of a bond together. We have very little in the way of a depth in our relationship. And so here are some things you could talk about that have some depth. What you read in the Bible today. Do you talk with your spouse about your devotional walk or what God's teaching you? You should learn to, even if it's a little awkward at first. Your concerns in life. Hey, I'm worried about something. Nicole sometimes would hesitate to tell me something she's frustrated by or worried over because of the way I respond. Well, you shouldn't think like that. Have some faith, woman. Well, that's not great at coaxing out more feelings, So concerns in life. Sometimes women say, this is how I feel, and guys are good at saying, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Just decide to stop feeling that way. That's not a constructive way to feel, but that doesn't work, necessarily. So we need to learn to cooperate with that. Talk to your spouse about something you'd like to pray about. And by the way, sometimes this is hard to learn. That's why I believe Dennis Rainey's advice to pray every night together is a great habit, because when you pray, most of us are at least used to talking to the Lord transparently and openly. And if we're still learning how to talk with each other at a level of depth, we could at least kneel beside each other or sit beside each other and hold hands and talk to the Lord with some level of depth. That'll help us. Talk about things you're thankful for. What a tragedy that we don't do that better. I'm thankful for this. I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for this about you. I'm thankful for this in the life of our kids. Life can become a drudgery in the middle years of diapers and laundry and homework and sports programs and youth activities and response. Life can become drudgery if we don't realize, wait a minute, we have 100 things to be thankful for. Let's talk about it. We talk about that, counting your blessings and the therapeutic nature of that and the spiritual nature of that at Thanksgiving time. But in a marriage even, that's something you could talk about. Hopes for your children. Areas where you want to grow. A couple of tips for communicating with depth in a way that is going to be effective is that you would determine what you want to say and then how you want to say it. We all know that you could say something differently and it would be taken better. And then when you want to say it. And then deep communication includes listening, learning to listen. James says we should be swift to hear and slow to speak. And most guys need to learn to listen a little more. And there are different levels of listening. There's fake listening, where you're just basically nodding your head. And then there's selective listening. Then there's defensive listening. We love this one. This is where we see everything as an attack and we see everything as a conflict and we need to correct our spouse. That's not good. Then there's surface listening, and then there's focused listening, where I'm trying to understand this precious person better because of what they're sharing with me. So you can communicate with depth. And then when we come back after lunch, we'll learn, letter B, that you can also communicate with grace. We need to learn to communicate with grace. And we'll talk about what that means later. Can we pray together? Lord, thank you for your goodness and your faithfulness to us and for these homes and relationships you've given us. And I pray that you'd bless our fellowship and our food and our meal and our families, our kids, and mostly, Lord, strengthen us. May we build our homes on a rock, the rock of your word. And we thank you for the opportunity to discuss these things. And I pray it'd bear fruit in our lives. In Jesus' name.